The trial drum had not yet finished its third beat when Murak Ashwalker rose from her seat on the stone bench and said his name. She did not say it softly. She did not say it the way a person might offer a greeting or a polite introduction. She said it the way a river says the name of the canyon it carved, low, inevitable, shaped by something that had been building for a very long time. She said it in the guttural roll of Orcish that made human consonants feel like they had weight and iron in them, and the sound of it cut straight through the argument the elder councilman had been building for 10 full minutes. Gideon Morgan. The entire gathering went still. There were perhaps 60 people inside the circle of salt, which was what the Ashwalker clan called the flat ring of pale stone slabs arranged outside their way camp on the high plains 3 miles east of Thorngate Trading Post. Some of those people were orc warriors in travel-stained leathers, their tusks decorated with copper rings. Some were human merchants who had requested the trial, sweating in their wool coats despite the autumn chill. Some were Thorngate locals who had come to watch because nothing interesting ever happened in Thorngate except when the Ashwalker clan passed through, and the Ashwalkers only came through twice a year. And then there was Gideon Morgan. He was standing at the edge of the circle with his hat in his hands, because one of the orc sentries had politely but firmly removed it from his head when he crossed the boundary, and he was turning the brim between his fingers without seeming to notice he was doing it. He was a tall man, lean in the way that outdoor work makes a person lean rather than in the way that hunger does. His shoulders were broad from years of working the pole and the rope on the river barge, and his forearms, where his sleeves were rolled to the elbow despite the cold, were corded with the kind of muscle that comes from hauling and loading and pushing against current. His face was weathered, his jaw rough with several days of dark stubble, and there were laugh lines at the corners of his brown eyes even though he was not laughing right now. He looked, in that moment, the way a man looks when he has been called to account for something he genuinely did not expect anyone to notice he did. Murak Ashwalker was already crossing the stone circle toward him. She was tall, nearly a head taller than him, with the deep green-gray skin of the Highland orc clans and black hair worn in a thick, practical braid that reached the middle of her back. Her tusks were modest by clan standards, curving just past her lower lip, and they were bare of any copper or bone decoration, which Gideon had learned, during his 3 years of running the ferry crossing at Thorngate Bend, meant that she was not yet spoken for. She was wearing fitted warrior's leathers, a close-cut vest of dark brown leather laced tight at the sides, fitted bracers, and riding trousers tucked into knee-high boots with iron buckles. It was the kind of outfit that was made for moving fast, and that had clearly seen significant use, the leather scuffed and re-oiled, and carrying the faded marks of old repairs. It fit her like it had been shaped to her body, which it had, and it did nothing to hide the fact that she was the most physically striking person in the circle of salt by a considerable margin. She stopped 6 feet from Gideon and looked at him for one long moment with eyes the color of old copper coins. Then she turned around and addressed the elder council. "He is my witness," she said, in the common trade tongue. "He was on the river when it happened. He saw the barge. He saw who was carrying what, and when, and in which direction. You want to know whether the Ashwalker clan brought the black spot sickness into Thorngate, elder councilman? Then you ask the man who was working the water that morning, because I will not stand here and be accused of poisoning a town I have traded with honestly for 11 years without putting the truth in front of this council." The elder councilman, a man named Draven Koss, 60 years old, with a face that had been sour for most of them, stood up very straight. "Ashwalker. The trial procedures do not permit. The trial procedures permit a witness testimony from any party present who holds relevant knowledge," said Murak, and her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had read the procedures. "That is the charter of the Salt Circle as agreed to between the Ashwalker clan and the Thorngate Merchant Council 43 years ago. The man standing there was running the river ferry on the morning of the 16th. He is present, he is relevant, and I am calling him to speak." Draven Koss looked at Gideon Morgan the way a man looks at something he wished had not shown up. Gideon put his hat on the stone bench behind him, straightened his vest, and walked into the center of the circle. He had known this was coming. She had sent a runner to the ferry dock 2 days ago with a folded note that said only, "Come to the Salt Circle on the morning of the 3rd. I need you to tell them what you saw." And he had spent those 2 days turning the question over in his mind. What he had seen, what he could swear to, what it would cost him to say it out loud in front of Draven Koss, who was also, as it happened, the man who held the lease on Gideon's ferry dock. He had come anyway. He turned to face the elder council, and he told them what he had seen on the morning of the 16th. A merchant barge, not an Ashwalker barge, a human merchant's barge out of the southern river towns, offloading crates marked with the crane symbol of a trading house called Redmast and Sons at the Thorngate dock, well before sunrise, moving faster than merchants usually moved. He told them that he had noted it because his was the only other boat on the water at that hour, and he had had to pull his ferry out of the channel to give the barge room, and he had been close enough to see the crates and the people handling them. He told them that he had learned 2 days later, when the first people in Thorngate fell sick, that Redmast and Sons had outstanding contracts to supply preserved grain to 3 border settlements, and that preserved grain, if it was stored badly or cut with cheaper materials to increase margins, had a long history of carrying exactly the kind of mold that caused the symptoms Thorngate was seeing. He told them that none of that was Murak Ashwalker or the Ashwalker clan. The circle was very quiet when he finished. Draven Koss said, in a careful tone, "You are aware, Morgan, that your dock lease is reviewed in 6 weeks." "I am," said Gideon, "and you are still standing by this testimony." Gideon looked at him steadily. Every word of it. He did not look at Murak when he said it. He was not saying it for her, or at least that was what he told himself. He was saying it because it was true, and because Thorngate had spent the last 3 weeks blaming an orc clan for a sickness that a human merchant had brought in on a night barge to avoid the morning toll inspection, and that was a wrong thing that he happened to be in a position to correct. The council deliberated for 40 minutes. Gideon sat on the stone bench with his hat in his lap. Murak stood at the edge of the circle with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she did not look at him either. But once, just once, when Draven Koss said something particularly cutting during the deliberation, he caught her looking sideways at him with an expression that was not easy to read but was not hostile. When the council came back, they cleared the Ashwalker clan of any connection to the sickness and recommended that the Thorngate Merchant Guild investigate Redmast and Sons. Draven Koss signed his name to the finding with the air of a man writing something he planned to make someone pay for later. The circle broke up. The orc warriors began gathering their things. The human merchants shuffled away in small, muttering groups. Gideon picked up his hat, stood, and was about to start the 3-mile walk back to the ferry dock when a hand closed around his arm. He turned. Murak Ashwalker was standing behind him. Up close she was even more impressive than she was at a distance. She was perhaps 2 or 3 years younger than his 32, he judged, and there was a fine scar running from the point of her left jaw toward her ear that he did not remember from before. Before being 3 years ago, when she had been one of 6 Ashwalker traders who crossed his ferry during the clan's autumn passage, and he had spent the crossing arguing with her about the ferry toll, which she maintained was extortionate, and which he maintained was the standard rate, and which she had eventually paid while continuing to maintain it was extortionate, and which he had lowered by 3 copper the following season without admitting that she had been right. "You did not have to come," she said. "You asked me to." "Asking does not obligate. I am aware of what that testimony costs you." He looked at her for a moment. Her hand was still on his arm, and it was warm through his sleeve, and she had not moved it. "The lease will sort itself out," he said. "Koss is bluster. He needs the ferry running or half his supplier contracts fall apart." Something shifted in her expression. It was not quite a smile, her jaw was still tight, the muscles in her face still braced for an argument, but it was something adjacent to relief, and it made her look younger for a moment and considerably less formidable. "Still," she said, "it was a significant thing to do." "You were right," he said simply. "The clan did not bring the sickness in. A man I recognized on a barge brought it in, and I was not going to let your people take the punishment for it just because it was easier for everyone to blame you." The hand on his arm tightened very slightly. Then she let go, and the loss of the warmth was more noticeable than he expected. "Walk back to the post with me," she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a command, and it landed somewhere in the middle in a way that Gideon found, to his own mild surprise, entirely agreeable. They walked. The high plains stretched out around them, gold and brown and enormous under a sky that had turned the particular shade of pale blue that meant serious cold was 2 or 3 weeks out. The wagon road was rutted from the summer's traffic and edged with dry grass that hissed in the wind. Thorngate Trading Post sat at the junction of the wagon road and the river road, a cluster of low buildings, a general store, a farrier's, 2 taverns, a grain merchant, a smith, and a row of storage yards that served as the last major supply point for 200 miles in any direction. It was not a beautiful place, but it was a useful one, and on any given day the population tripled or quadrupled with travelers and traders passing through. In the weeks since the sickness had come, foot traffic had dropped by half. "How bad is it?" Gideon asked, because the silence was comfortable but not so comfortable that he wanted to keep it indefinitely. "In the town." 11 dead, said Murak. 30 still sick. The healer at the post has been managing it, but she is running short on the right medicines, and the supply wagon from the south is 2 weeks late, which is connected to the sickness spreading to the river towns, which is connected to Redmast and Sons, who have apparently been shipping contaminated grain across 4 river routes. She paused. "I am going south with a party of 6. We have contacts in the hill settlements who trade in medicinal herbs. We can move faster than a wagon." "How long?" 3 weeks if the weather holds. He nodded. They were coming up on the first buildings of Thorngate now, and a few people on the main road were looking at Murak the way people in frightened towns look at whoever they have most recently decided to blame. 2 men outside the farrier's yard stopped talking and watched her walk by with flat, unfriendly expressions. Gideon did not slow down. He matched his pace to hers, and he put himself very slightly between her and the men. Not dramatically, not in a way that made a statement, just a small adjustment that put his shoulder toward them and his body in the way, and he kept walking and kept talking as if none of it was happening. "If you run into Delaprat's trading post in the hills, she keeps a large stock of silver bark, good for fever." Murak glanced at him sideways. She had noticed the small repositioning. He could tell from the way her chin lifted slightly. "I know Delaprat," she said. "I will bring extra." They reached the junction where the wagon road met the river road. Murak stopped. The Ashwalker camp was north of town, and Gideon's ferry dock was half a mile south down the river road, and this was where their paths divided. He stopped beside her. She turned to face him, and for a moment she just looked at him with those copper-coin eyes, direct and unblinking in the orc way that humans often found unsettling but that Gideon had always found clarifying. It was the kind of gaze that did not leave much room for misunderstanding. "When I come back," she said, "I will cross on your ferry." "My ferry runs every morning and 2 afternoons," he said, "weather permitting." "I know your schedule," she said. "I have crossed on your ferry 4 times in 3 years. He looked at her. "I remember everyone." That was perhaps more honest than he had intended to be, and he saw the moment she registered it, a very slight widening of those remarkable eyes, a fractional pause, and then she said quietly, "So do I," and turned and walked north toward the camp without looking back. Gideon stood at the junction for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, watching her go, and then turned south toward the river. The dock was exactly as he had left it, the barge tied at the near post, the ferry platform in good order, the small lockbox beside the ticket plank undisturbed. It was a humble operation. The barge was wide-bottomed and flat, built for carrying goods and animals across the river at the Thorngate Bend, where the water was too deep to ford, and the nearest bridge was 30 miles downstream. He had been running it for 3 years, since he had saved enough from his previous work on the river boats to buy out the previous ferryman when the man retired. It was not exciting work most days. It was weather watching and load balancing and arguing with farmers about livestock fees. But it was his, and it put him on the water, and the water was the only place he had ever felt entirely at home. He sat on the dock post and looked at the river for a while and thought about the way she had said his name at the trial. He had heard his name said many ways. His mother had said it gently, when she was still alive. His old river captain had bellowed it across the water when he made an error. Draven Koss said it with a particular thin quality, like a man reminding himself to be polite to someone he didn't like. Various creditors and landlords and dock masters had said it in the tones reserved for business. Murak Ashwalker had said it like she meant for it to carry somewhere, like it was a word with a destination. He had no good framework for that, and he sat with it for a while, and then he got up and went to do the afternoon crossing, because the Thorngate Mill farmer was waiting on the east bank with a wagon of late grain. The 3 weeks she was gone were not quiet ones. Draven Koss did, in fact, cause trouble about the dock lease. Not directly, because he was not quite bold enough to pull the lease outright when Gideon's testimony had just been recorded in the Salt Circle Charter, and would look extremely retaliatory. But he sent 2 of his associates to complain about noise and hours and loading practices, and he commissioned a survey of the dock boundaries that suddenly questioned whether the eastern tie post was inside the leased area. Gideon dealt with all of this with patience and a very careful paper trail, writing down every complaint, every date, every name, and sending copies to the Thorngate charter keeper, who was not Koss's associate and who took the responsibility of charter records extremely seriously. The sickness in Thorngate worsened for a week, then stabilized as the healer found better methods of managing it. 7 more people died before it peaked. After the peak, it began to slow. The town remained frightened and suspicious and half-empty, and the remaining merchants and residents moved through the days with the tight, short-tempered energy of people who had been scared for too long. Gideon ran the ferry every day except when ice formed on the water, which happened twice, briefly, during a cold snap in the 2nd week. He spoke to people who crossed, listened to their worries about the sickness, their complaints about the food shortages, their anger that no one had done anything about Redmast and Sons yet, and their various theories about what had caused everything. He did not argue with the ones who still thought the Ashwalkers were involved, despite the trial finding, because arguing with frightened people in public was rarely productive. But he also did not agree with them, and once, when a man loading cattle onto the barge said something particularly vicious about orc traders and disease, Gideon said, very quietly, "That's enough," in a tone that ended the conversation. On the 22nd day, he was doing the late afternoon crossing with a load of empty grain sacks and 2 travelers going east when he saw the dust on the north road. There were 7 of them, moving at a steady pace, 6 riders on the big, sure-footed plains horses that the Ashwalker clan bred, and 1 pack horses loaded down with bundled goods. They came down the north road and turned east along the river road, and when they were close enough, he could see that the lead rider was Murak, and that she was carrying something across the front of her saddle, and that all 7 of them looked tired in the particular way of people who have been moving hard and fast for a long time. He pulled the ferry into the dock and tied it and walked up to meet them. Murak swung down from the horse before it had completely stopped, which was a thing she did with a fluid, casual ease that made it look like no effort at all. She was carrying a large bundle of dried herbs wrapped in oilskin, and her braid was dusty and her boots were muddy, and there was a new scrape along the back of her left hand that had been cleaned and left to close on its own. She looked trail-worn and alert and immensely alive, and she walked straight up to him and said, "We have the silver bark," An alder root which your healer will want for the secondary fever symptoms. Is she still at the post? Still there, he said. She will be very glad to see you. Good. Murak turned and said something to the riders in Orcish, and two of them took the pack horses and headed toward the town. Then she turned back to Gideon, and for a moment neither of them said anything. How is the town? She asked, still scared, still blaming people it shouldn't, but the worst of the sickness has passed. He looked at the scrape on her hand. What happened? She glanced at her hand as if she had forgotten it was there. We went through the Brack Hills. There was a problem with a man who had been cutting the herb stock and selling the remainder to travelers as full portions. He was not pleased when we interrupted his operation. How many of you against how many of him? 7 of us, 4 of him, she said, with a slight dry inflection that suggested she did not feel the numbers had ever been in question. He was uninjured. His associates were moderately uncomfortable. We confiscated the herb stock, and I added his name to the charter complaint I intend to file with the Merchant Guild, because he is also almost certainly affiliated with Redmast and Sons and the contaminated grain chain. She paused. I am not spending 3 weeks gathering evidence and riding through a cold snap just to leave half the problem standing. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Have you eaten? She blinked. It was a small blink, but it was there. Not since this morning. Come on then, he said, and he turned and led her to the small shed he used as a dock office and a rest station, which was not a large or impressive space, but did have a stove that was already going because he had been burning a low fire all day against the cold, and a wooden table and 2 chairs, and a covered pot of the barley and dried meat stew he had put on at midday, because he always made too much for one person, and he had long since stopped questioning why he did that. She ducked through the doorway she had to duck. The doorframe was sized for human heights, and looked around the shed with an expression that was not commentary but was attentive, noting the organization of it, the way he kept things, the small details that accumulate in a space a person inhabits every day. There was a shelf of charts and toll records above the desk, a rope hook by the door, a lantern hanging from the rafter, and on the windowsill, a single smooth river stone that was perhaps not a functional item. She sat down at the table. He put a bowl of stew in front of her and poured 2 cups of water and sat down across from her, and she ate without ceremony, which he appreciated, and for a while the only sound was the stove and the river outside. The lease, she said eventually. Cas. Still has it, he said. Still causing trouble. It will resolve itself. If it does not resolve itself, she said, the Ashwalker clan will be making our biannual passage in approximately 5 months. We cross your ferry every time, as a matter of clan practice. That represents a significant portion of your annual revenue. It would be a simple thing for me to have it documented that our continued use of this crossing is contingent on the lease remaining in the name of the current ferryman. He stared at her. Economic pressure, she said, without any particular expression. It is a legitimate tool. You would do that. I would do that, she said, and she looked at him directly in the way she had, and there was nothing coy about it, nothing angled or strategic in the way she looked at him. It was direct. You came to the trial. You said true things that cost you something. I do not forget that kind of thing. He looked down at his cup. There was a tightness in his chest that was not unpleasant. It was the feeling of being seen accurately by someone who was paying genuine attention, and it was a feeling he did not have a great deal of practice receiving. You don't owe me anything, Murak. I am not speaking about debt, she said. I am speaking about, she stopped. She looked at her bowl for a moment and something moved across her face, brief and private. In the clan, when someone acts with that kind of honesty at cost to themselves, we call it a standing act. It changes how you are regarded. It creates an obligation not of debt but of regard, the obligation to act with equivalent honesty in return. She looked up. That is what I am doing. He held her gaze. Then thank you, he said, genuinely. She nodded once, and there was a slight warmth in it that had not been there 3 weeks ago, and they sat together in the shed by the stove while the last of the afternoon light went golden on the river. And they talked about the hill settlements and what she had found there, about the ferry business and the seasonal patterns of trade, about the sickness and what the merchant guild was likely to do about Redmast, about small things and larger ones, and it was the most comfortable Gideon Morgan had felt in company in longer than he could easily remember. When she left, she put her hand briefly on the doorframe and looked back at him, and she said, "I will cross in the morning. East Bank, then back." "I will be on the water," he said. She crossed in the morning, and the morning after that, and 4 more mornings over the following 2 weeks while the Ashwalker clan rested and resupplied at the way camp before continuing south. Each morning she came to the dock first, before the other travelers, and sometimes they had 20 minutes on the water together in the cold early light, and sometimes they had only the crossing itself, which was perhaps 8 minutes depending on the current. She always paid the toll and never mentioned the extortion remark again, which he thought was generous of her. He always had the ferry ready before she arrived, which was slightly earlier than he would have gotten up otherwise, and he did not examine that too closely. On the 5th morning she kissed him. They were at mid-crossing, the barge moving slowly on the cold water, the town behind them and nothing ahead but the reeds of the East Bank, and she had been telling him about the clan's winter route south, and he had been listening and watching the current, and she had simply turned toward him and put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him with a directness and warmth that was entirely in keeping with everything else about her. He did not move for a moment. Then he put his hands over hers and kissed her back, and the barge drifted slightly off course into the shallow water where the reeds grew, which he had never permitted in 3 years of ferrying, and he did not care at all. When they separated, she was looking at him with an expression that was fully readable for the first time, warm and certain and pleased in a way that made her look, for a moment, like someone who had made a decision they were very satisfied with. "I have been thinking about doing that," she said, "since the morning of the trial." He looked at her. His hands were still over hers on his face. "The morning of the trial you were in the middle of making a legal argument." "I can hold 2 things in my attention at the same time," she said, and she was smiling now, full and genuine, and the smile changed her face the way sunlight changes a landscape. Everything was the same and everything was different. He laughed. It came out rough with surprise and pleasure, and he shook his head and looked at the reeds they were stuck in and then back at her. "I need to get us out of the reeds," he said. "You should probably do that," she agreed, and she let go of his face and stepped back and stood on the barge while he pushed off from the reed bank with the pole, and she was still smiling, and he was also smiling, and the morning light on the water was gold and cold and extremely beautiful. She crossed east and came back west, and she paid the toll both ways, and when she walked back up the river road toward the post, she looked over her shoulder once, and his heart did something complicated, and he stood on his dock in the cold holding the pole and thought, "I am in serious trouble," and it was the most genuinely delighted he had felt about being in serious trouble in his entire life. 3 days later, Draven Koss called him to his office. Koss's office was in the back of the Thorngate Charter House, a stone building on the main road that smelled of old ink and ambition. Koss sat behind a large desk and had 2 associates standing behind him, which was a theatrical choice that Gideon noted and set aside. On the desk between them was the dock lease, and beside the dock lease was a letter, folded and sealed with a red wax seal he did not recognize. "I am going to be direct with you, Morgan," said Koss. "I appreciate that," said Gideon, and sat down without being invited to, because the power of a large desk is substantially reduced when the person across from it is sitting. "The trial finding stands," said Koss, in a tone suggesting he had spent some time being irritated about this. "The guild investigation is proceeding. I am prepared to let the lease question drop." He paused, "in exchange for a small adjustment to your operating practice." "What practice?" Koss looked at the letter. "There have been complaints, formal complaints, submitted to my office about the conduct of the Thorngate River Ferry." Specifically, the practice of providing preferential service to orc traders. Earlier start times, reduced wait periods, extended crossing hours during clan passage. Gideon looked at the letter. Who submitted the complaints? That information is confidential, I understand. He looked at Koss. I run the ferry on a first-come, first-served basis with rates established in the original lease agreement. Every crossing is documented. If someone is receiving shorter wait times, it is because they arrived first. If the Ashwalker clan accounts for a disproportionate share of early crossings, it is because they are consistently early risers. He paused. I am happy to have the charter keeper review my records. Koss's jaw tightened. What I am suggesting, Morgan, is a slightly different arrangement, one that might encourage you to manage the timing of certain crossings in a way that makes the post's other traders feel their business is equally valued. You want me to refuse service to orc traders or make them wait. I want you to be, because that is what you are describing, and that is not a thing I will do. Gideon stood up. The lease is a contract, councilman. It says I run the crossing. It does not say I choose who crosses based on the preferences of people who submit anonymous complaints to your office. He picked up his hat. If you want to pursue this, go ahead and do it formally. But I want it on the record, in writing, that this meeting happened and what was proposed in it. He left Koss's office and went directly to the charter keeper and made a written record of the conversation. He did not go immediately to Murak with any of this, because he did not want it to look like he was asking her for the economic leverage she had offered, or using the situation to increase the intimacy between them in a calculated way. He was not that sort of man. But that evening, when she came to the dock at sundown, she had taken to coming in the evenings sometimes, when the last crossing was done and he was securing the barge and asked him how his day had gone, he told her. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she said, Koss sent those complaints himself or had them sent. There are no other merchants in Thorngate who would bother filing a formal complaint about ferry timing. Probably, he said. He is trying to use you to do something he cannot do himself because the trial record is public. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in a tone that was very flat and very controlled, he is a coward who hides behind procedures. She looked at the river. I want to handle this. I know, he said, but I have it handled. The charter keeper has the record, Koss knows it. He will not move formally against the lease now because the paper trail leads directly back to him, and the guild investigation is already looking at his association with the southern merchants. He looked at her. I am telling you because I said I would be honest with you, not because I need you to fix it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, you are a frustrating man to try to help. I know that too, he said, and she made a sound that was halfway between a growl and a laugh, which was a sound he was discovering he found extremely endearing. She sat beside him on the dock with her boots off the edge and her feet over the water, and he sat beside her in the same way, and they watched the evening light fail on the river, and she told him that the clan would be moving south in 4 days, and that the winter route took them through the lower hills and across the flatlands to the southern grazing grounds, and that she would not be back through Thorngate until spring. Spring, he said. The end of the melt season. April, if the pass is clear on time. That is a long time. She looked at him sideways. It is. He looked at the water. He was not a man who was good at saying the things he was feeling directly, but he had been working on it, or trying to, for the duration of the time he had known her, because she was the kind of person who made indirection feel like a waste. I will miss you, he said, more than is probably reasonable given the amount of time we have actually spent together. The amount of time is not the measure, she said. The Orcish word for it is roughly root knowing, the knowledge of someone that goes deeper than the surface of acquaintance because you have seen them when it mattered. We have seen each other when it mattered several times. She paused. I will also miss you. More than is reasonable. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the river. He could see the fine line of her profile against the darkening sky, the strong jaw, the modest curve of the tusks, the solid architecture of her face that was beautiful in the way that things built for purpose and endurance are beautiful. He thought about the ferry crossing 3 years ago when she had argued about the toll, and about her voice saying his name in the salt circle, and about her hands on his face on the barge, and about sitting across from her at the small table in the dock shed while she ate stew and talked about charter law and herb traders in the Brack Hills, and he thought, "This is the thing I have been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it." "Come back in spring," he said. "I will," she said. Not a question, not a conditional. A statement of fact in the tone she used for things she was certain about. She left 4 days later with the clan, heading south in a long, organized column along the wagon road, and Gideon stood at the road's edge and watched them go, and she turned once in her saddle and looked at him, and that was enough. The winter was long. Not dramatically terrible. The sickness had burned itself out in November after the herb shipment arrived, and the guild investigation had locked down the redmast grain routes, and Koss had retreated into a sulky silence after the charter keeper's records made his position untenable, and the ferry business recovered as traders began moving through Thorngate again in increasing numbers in December and January. Gideon's life settled back into its ordinary rhythms. He ran the ferry, documented his crossings, maintained the barge, kept his records in meticulous order, had dinner at the Thorngate Tavern twice a week, and spent his evenings in the dock shed with a lantern and whatever book he was reading and the sound of the river outside. It was a life that suited him. It always had. He was not, by nature, a man who needed a great deal of noise and company. He had grown up on the river boats where the crew was small and the work was the thing, and he had learned to find companionship in the quality of the work and the movement of the water. Loneliness was not something he felt as a sharp absence, but rather as a kind of background hum, the particular silence that settles in a life that is good but not complete. He felt the hum more in the winter. He wrote to her once in late November, a short note carried south on a courier wagon that the Thorngate post office said had contacts along the clan's winter route. He was not sure whether it would reach her or how long it would take, but he wrote it anyway. He told her that Koss had been quiet. He told her that the sickness was over. He told her that he had fixed the eastern tie post, and it turned out it had always been within the lease boundary, and the survey had been conducted by someone with a reason to read the numbers wrong. He told her that the river had frozen at the edges in January, and the ice was remarkable to look at in the morning. He told her he hoped the winter route was going well. He did not reread the letter before he sent it, because if he reread it, he would find a reason not to send it. In February, a courier came south from the hill country with a letter in a hand he did not recognize and writing that was not in the common tongue. He took it to the post house, and the post keeper, who had 40 years of trade languages under her belt, read it for him. It was in Orcish. It said roughly that the winter route had been largely uneventful except for a dispute about grazing rights with another clan that had been resolved without violence, but required 3 days of formal negotiation, which Murak found exhausting, and that she had received his letter, and that the detail about the frozen river made her want to see it, and that she was glad the sickness was over and that Koss had gone quiet, and that she had been thinking about the conversation on the dock, and that in Orcish tradition there was a phrase that roughly translated to "I am keeping a place in my thinking for you," which meant something more than casual regard and something slightly less than a formal declaration, and that she was using that phrase now and wanted him to know it. He folded the letter very carefully and put it in the box under the desk where he kept the documents that mattered. March was cold and rainy, and the wagon traffic increased as traders pushed north trying to beat the spring mud season. Gideon ran the ferry every day, and the days were full enough that time moved, if not quickly, at least steadily. He caught himself thinking about her at odd moments, not in a mooning, distracted way, but in the way he thought about the river in winter when he was indoors, a background awareness of something he cared about that was currently at a distance. He also, because he was a man who was bad at sitting still when he could do something useful, spent part of the winter making improvements to the dock shed. He added a better stove flue and a second chair with a back on it, and a shelf for items that were not work documents, and he reworked the doorframe so a person of larger stature would not have to duck to enter. And then he stood in the completed shed one evening and looked at the two-chairedness of it and the redone doorframe and acknowledged to himself what he had been doing. April came. The passes cleared early. The clan's spring passage was announced at the Thorngate post house on the 7th, which meant they were crossing the high plains and would reach the trading post within the week. On the 12th, he was doing the early crossing with a farmer's cart when he looked up and saw the cloud of dust on the south road, which was the wrong direction for the clan to be coming from, and it was moving fast, which was unusual, and there were 4 riders moving very hard. He finished the crossing and was tying up when the riders came into the post yard. One of them was a young orc man he recognized from the Ashwalker clan, one of the scouts, he thought, though he did not know the name, and the scout was off his horse before it stopped and running toward Gideon with an urgency that made his stomach drop. Morgan, the scout, was breathing hard. Murak Ashwalker, she says to come to the South Way camp. Now, he paused, catching his breath. There has been a problem. She is not hurt, but she needs you there. Gideon tied the barge, left a closed sign on the dock plank, and rowed south. The South Way camp was 2 miles below the post, a broad, flat area where the clan set up their large hide tents during the seasonal passages. It was a substantial encampment, 40 or 50 tents, horses on the picket lines, cooking fires going, the organized bustle of a large group in transition. It should have had the comfortable energy of an arrival in progress. Instead, it had the tight, coiled quality of a group that had just had a very bad thing happen and was waiting to find out what was going to happen next. Murak was standing at the center of the camp near the fire ring, and she was not hurt, as the scout had said. She was completely physically intact, in fact, and standing very straight, with her arms at her sides and her chin up in a posture that Gideon was coming to recognize as the posture she adopted when something had happened that made her angry enough to be very controlled about it. Beside her was a man he recognized, and the recognition hit him like cold water. Aldrich Bryn. Aldrich Bryn was the senior broker for the Thorngate Merchant Guild, a man of 45 with a pleasant face and a generous manner who had given Gideon referrals to half his regular commercial clients, and who had been, as far as Gideon had understood, genuinely sympathetic during the lease dispute. Gideon had bought him a drink after the charter record was filed and thanked him for the support, and Aldrich Bryn had clapped him on the shoulder and said that fair dealing deserved fair treatment, and that he had always thought Koss was overreaching. Aldrich Bryn was standing in the middle of the Ashwalker Way camp with 2 orc warriors bracketing him and looking like a man who had recently been caught doing something he could not explain away. Gideon swung down from the horse and went to Murak and stopped in front of her. She looked at him, and the controlled quality in her face shifted very slightly, became something a few degrees warmer and more complicated, and she said, "Thank you for coming." "What happened?" She looked at Aldrich Bryn. Her voice, when she spoke, was even and deliberate. "His name came up in the records I gathered from the Brack Hills trader during the herb operation. A financial record showing payments to the trader from a Thorngate account. I recognize the account number because it is the same account that is used for the Guild's emergency grain fund, which Bryn administers." She paused. The grain fund that was supposed to purchase emergency supply shipments for Thorngate during the sickness. Gideon looked at Bryn. Bryn looked at his own shoes. "He has been running a diversion scheme," said Murak. "Guild funds redirected to pay for herb supply corruption in the hills, which drove up prices and created scarcity, which created a need for the Guild to purchase more emergency grain, which was supplied by Redmast and Sons, which is owned in part through a series of intermediary accounts by—" She paused and looked at Bryn directly. "This man." Bryn said, in a careful voice, "This is a very serious accusation. I have the records, said Murak. I have copies in 3 locations, which is a precaution I took before I rode north, because the records from the Brack Hills operation were interesting enough that I thought they might be at risk. She looked at Gideon. He came to the way camp this morning. He told me that he was there on behalf of the guild to verify our passage permits. That is a procedure that does not exist. The way camp permits are handled at the post house. There is no reason for a guild broker to come to the way camp in person. She paused. He was looking for the documents. Gideon looked at Aldrich Bryn and felt something cold and disappointed settle in his chest. He had bought this man a drink. He had thanked him. He had thought the support was real. How connected is he to Koss? He asked. Deeply, said Murak. The account structures make it clear. Koss provided the local political cover. Bryn ran the financial mechanism. And Redmas supplied the contaminated grain while charging emergency prices. She looked at Gideon steadily. 11 people died in Thorngate. 30 more were severely ill. The sickness spread to the river towns because the contaminated supply was deliberately distributed through as many channels as possible to maximize the demand for emergency supply. The cold settled deeper. They did it on purpose, he said. The sickness. They did not introduce the mold intentionally, she said carefully. But when the mold appeared in the supply chain, they chose to distribute the contaminated grain rather than quarantine it, because the profit from the emergency contracts was greater than the cost of destroying the stock. She paused. The distinction may or may not matter to you. It does not matter a great deal to me. Gideon looked at Bryn for a long moment. Bryn looked back at him with the expression of a man running calculations. You were very helpful to me during the lease dispute, Gideon said. Bryn said nothing. You pointed me toward the charter keeper. You told me to document everything. He paused. You knew the lease dispute would fail. You helped me manage it because it kept me distracted and cooperative, and it gave you visibility into what I knew about the trial. He looked at Murak. He knew what I had seen on the river. If the testimony failed, the trial finding failed, the investigation failed, and the whole scheme stayed buried. Yes, said Murak. He was covering his exposure from the inside. Yes, she looked at him. I am sorry that someone you trusted was doing this. I wanted you to hear it from me directly and not from a post-house notice. He stood for a moment with that. Then he straightened and looked at Aldrich Bryn and said, You are going to come with me to the charter house, and you are going to sit down with the charter keeper and Murak Ashwalker, and you are going to answer every question honestly, and then the law of the Thorngate Charter is going to determine what happens to you. He paused. Alternatively, you can try to leave, in which case the Ashwalker clan is going to make that extremely difficult for you, and I am going to take Murak's documents directly to the regional magistrate without your cooperation, and that will go significantly worse for you. Bryn said, after a moment, I will cooperate. They rode back to Thorngate. What followed was not swift. It took 3 days of charter sessions, the arrival of a regional magistrate who had been summoned by fast courier, and the production of every document Murak had copies of, plus additional records that emerged from the guild office, once the magistrate had authority to compel disclosure. Koss resigned from the Elder Council on the 2nd day, before the magistrate could formally serve him, and was subsequently found to have been absent from Thorngate since the previous evening, which caused a brief disruption and a good deal of running around that eventually concluded with him being located at a river crossing 30 miles downstream by 2 of the regional magistrate's officers. Murak was present for all of it. She sat in the charter house with her documents in meticulous order and answered questions with the flat, precise authority of someone who had prepared very carefully, and she gave every piece of evidence she had gathered without theater or embellishment, just fact after fact laid out in order, and the picture that emerged was damning and complete. Gideon sat beside her through most of it, not because he had a legal role in the proceedings, but because he had testimony of his own to contribute, and because when the sessions got long and tense, and they did, particularly when Koss was brought back and placed in the same room as his original scheme, She would occasionally put her hand briefly on the table where his hand was resting, just a brush of contact, and he understood that it was not a gesture of distress but of acknowledgement. "I know you are there. I am glad you are here." On the evening of the third day, after the magistrate had concluded the primary session, and the formal process was handed off to the regional guild authority for final resolution, they walked out of the charter house together into the April evening, which was cool and smelled of rain and new mud and the green smell of early growth, and they stood on the road outside and Gideon tipped his head back and looked at the sky. "Is it done?" he asked. "The formal proceedings are done," she said. "The guild resolution will take months. Bryn and Koss will face consequences that will likely include significant financial penalty and removal from all charter positions. Whether it rises to criminal prosecution depends on whether the magistrate's report characterizes the grain distribution decision as negligence or intent." She paused. "I believe it will be characterized as intent. The records are explicit enough." He nodded. "Good." He looked at her. She was standing beside him in the road, dusty from 3 days of hard-backed charter chairs and close rooms, and she looked exactly as she always looked, solid and clear-eyed and present in a way that made everything around her feel more actual. "You did all of that," he said. "The records, the Brack Hills operation, coming to the trial in the first place. You did all of that." "You came to the trial," she said. "You made the testimony that gave the council no alternative. That was one morning. You spent months." "Someone had to," she said simply. "And I am not someone who can walk past a wrong thing if I have the means to address it." She looked at him with the directness he had come to rely on. "Also," she said, and her voice shifted slightly, becoming something quieter and more deliberate, "I wanted to see you again. When I left in autumn, I had a great many more things I wanted to say to you, and I was not going to let a scheme by small, greedy men prevent me from coming back to say them." He looked at her for a long time in the April evening. There were people moving on the road behind them and light coming through the charter house windows, and somewhere further along the road the sound of horses and the post-house bell marking the hour, and all of it was very ordinary and very much the world going on as it did. And in the middle of all of it she was looking at him with the copper-coin eyes and her chin slightly lifted, and the very slight vulnerability of a person who has just said a true and significant thing. "Say them, then," he said. "I have been thinking about you all winter," she said. "I sent a letter in Orcish because it felt safer to say true things in a language where the weight of them would be diluted by translation. That was not honest of me." She paused. "So I will be honest now. I want to be with you, not in the way of crossing your ferry and coming to your dock in the evenings, though I want those things also. I want to be with you the way the clan means when they say anchor companion, the person you return to, who is the reason returning has direction." She looked at him steadily. "I am telling you this now because the clan leaves on the 16th and I will not be able to stay past that date, and I would rather say it badly now than not say it at all." Gideon was quiet for a moment. The river sound carried on the evening air from a block to the south, familiar and constant. "What does an anchor companion mean practically?" he asked. "Between your life and mine?" "I do not know exactly," she said. "I know that the clan's route crosses through Thorngate twice a year and that I have considerable discretion about where I spend the time between passages. I know that you are the ferryman here and that is a rooted kind of work. I know that these things can be arranged around each other if both people want to arrange them." She paused. "Do you want to?" "Yes," he said, with no hesitation whatsoever. Something in her face unlocked. It was not dramatic. She did not make an exclamation or throw her arms around him, though he had a feeling she might have wanted to, but her whole expression opened in a way that made her look entirely, luminously happy. And she took one step forward, and he took one step forward, and she put her hands on his face the way she had on the barge, and kissed him in the middle of the public road outside the Thorngate Charter House, which he thought was probably the most honest and most Murak thing she could possibly have done. She left on the 16th, as the clan's schedule required. She came back on the 28th. He was doing the morning crossing when he saw her riding north on the river road, alone, with a travel pack on the saddle behind her. She rode down to the dock and pulled up and looked at him on the barge with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is entirely at peace with it. "The clan is continuing south," she said. "I have negotiated a 4-month period of independent travel. It is a recognized status in the clan structure. It allows senior members to pursue significant personal matters between passages." She looked at him. "You are a significant personal matter." He tied the barge off and looked up at her on the horse. 4 months. Until the autumn passage. At which point I will rejoin the clan for the south route and we will see." She tilted her head slightly. "Unless you have a reason you would prefer I not stay." "I don't have that reason," he said. She dismounted and tied the horse to the dock post and came down onto the barge beside him, and she put her hand on his chest, flat and warm, and looked at him from very close. "Then I am staying," she said. The 4 months were. He would think about them later, sorting through memories the way you sort through valuable objects, the best months of his adult life. She did not move into the dock shed, which was too small and not suited for living, but she rented a room at the better of Thorngate's 2 taverns, the one run by a woman named Sorrel who had been trading with the Ashwalker clan for 20 years, and who received Murak with a courtesy that was genuine rather than performed. From the room she operated her own considerable work correspondence with the clan, follow-up on the guild resolution, additional documentation for the magistrate's ongoing case against Bryn and Koss, and she came to the dock in the mornings and sometimes afternoons, and in the evenings they ate together, at the tavern or in the shed, or, on good evenings, on the dock itself with their feet over the water. The town was adjusting to her presence in the way towns adjust to things they did not expect. Some people were uncomfortable. Some people were openly hostile in the petty ways of the afraid conversations that stopped, service at the grain merchant that was slower than it needed to be, looks that lingered past courtesy. She took all of it with an equanimity that was not passivity, but was rather the calm of someone who had decided not to spend energy on things that were not worth the expenditure. And when something crossed the line from uncomfortable into genuinely rude, she handled it herself, directly and without drama, in a way that was generally more effective than any intervention Gideon might have made on her behalf. Once in May, a man outside the farrier's yard said something loud enough and specific enough that Gideon stepped toward him. Murak's hand closed around his arm gently from behind. "I have it," she said quietly. And she went forward and spoke to the man in a voice that was calm and very specific, and that, from Gideon's position, he could not entirely hear, but whose effect was visible in the way the man's posture changed from aggressive to deeply uncomfortable to the slightly shrunken quality of a person who has been made to see themselves clearly. He did not say anything further. He went inside the farrier's yard and did not come back out while they were on the street. Gideon looked at her when she came back. "What did you say to him?" "I described what his behavior looked like from the outside," she said, "and what it indicated about his character, and I asked whether he was satisfied with that indication." She paused. "He was not." "That's very effective. Most people," she said, "are more concerned with their own image than they appear to be. They simply need someone to hold the image in front of them." She glanced at him sideways. "Also, I am significantly larger than he is, and I was speaking from extremely close range, which may have contributed to the quality of his attention." He laughed, and she smiled, and they walked on. The evenings were his favorite time. After the dock was closed and the barge was secured and the day's toll count was done, they would sit together, on the dock in good weather, in the shed when it rained, which it did a great deal through May and June, and talk for hours. She was the most interesting person he had spent time with in years, which was partly about how much she had done and seen and knew, and partly about the quality of her attention when she was listening, which was the kind of attention that made you hear yourself more clearly, and often find that you were saying things you had not known you wanted to say. He told her about the river boats, the years he had worked for other men on the water before saving enough to buy the ferry. He told her about his parents, both gone now, his mother when he was 19 and his father the year he bought the ferry, and about the feeling of working towards something they did not get to see completed. He told her about the loneliness of the work, which was not the grinding, desperate loneliness of someone in crisis, but the background loneliness of someone whose life was full of acquaintances and thin on people who actually knew him. She listened to all of it with the copper-coin eyes and the full quality of her attention, and she told him her own things in return: the clan life, the responsibility of being a senior member, the years of negotiating and trading and traveling, the weight of carrying the clan's interests in every room she walked into. She told him about her father, who had been the clan's previous passage master, and from whom she had learned most of what she knew about reading people and reading situations. She told him about the scar on her jaw, which was from a knife, from a man in a border town 5 years ago who had not liked her being in the market without an escort, and she told him about it flatly and without drama, but she watched him when she told it, and he understood that she was watching to see what he did with the information. He did not perform rage on her behalf, because she did not need that. He said, "I am sorry that happened," and meant it plainly, and then he reached out and very gently put his thumb along the line of the scar, the way you might acknowledge a thing that was present without making it larger than it was. She went very still when he did that. Then she turned her face slightly into his hand, and the gesture was small and enormous at the same time. In June, after a long evening on the dock when the river was at its summer fullness, and the insects were singing in the reeds, and the sky was so full of stars it looked implausible, she told him that in Orc tradition there was a declaration that was more formal than "I am keeping a place in my thinking for you," and less formal than a bonding ceremony, a thing called the spoken claim, which was simply the statement of intent to be with a person in the anchor companion sense, said aloud, and without qualification. "I want to say it to you," she said, "if you want me to." He looked at her in the starlight. "Yes," he said, "please." She said it in Orcish first, which meant he could not follow the specific words but could follow the weight of them, low and deliberate and certain, each word placed with care. Then she said it in the common tongue: "Gideon Morgan, I claim you as my anchor companion. I intend you. I choose you. I will return to you. This is not a conditional or a convenience. This is a standing decision." He was quiet for a moment after. The river ran. The stars stayed where they were. He said, in a voice that came out a little rough with something he did not name but felt entirely, "Then you have me, and I intend you too." All of it returning, staying, all of it, whatever shape it takes. She put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back, and they sat like that on the dock while the river ran underneath them, and the stars continued being implausible in the summer sky. The intimacy between them built the way real things build, not all at once, not on a schedule, but steadily and with honesty on both sides. She was the one who moved toward him first, most of the time, bold and direct in the way that was simply her nature, and he found, and it still surprised him every time, that being wanted that clearly and that certainly by this particular person was the most transformative experience of his adult life. Not because he had been desperate for want, but because her wanting him was specific. She did not want company. She did not want reassurance. She wanted him, Gideon Morgan, ferryman of the Thorngate Bend, the man who had stood in the salt circle and said true things at cost to himself, the man who sat on the dock in the evenings with his feet over the water, the man whose laugh came out rough with surprise. She knew the particulars and she chose them. He learned her particulars in return. The way she read trail signs when they went north along the river road together, pointing out things he would have walked past. A bent stem that meant a large animal, a particular pattern of mud that meant rain by evening. The way she argued, which was precise and never personal, which was deeply disorienting to anyone who was used to arguments becoming personal, and which was, once he understood it, a form of respect. The way she looked at the river, with a recognition that he understood, was the look of someone who felt the same way about large moving water that he did, that it was a thing with character, not just a feature. The summer guild resolution came through in late July. Bryn received a formal conviction for financial fraud and misappropriation of guild funds, with significant financial penalty and a lifetime ban from guild operations. Koss, who had been apprehended and returned to Thorngate, received a narrower finding. He had been complicit in the cover-up and the lease manipulation, but the direct link to the contaminated grain scheme was harder to establish legally, and the magistrate's finding reflected that distinction. But he lost his seat on the Elder Council, his charter positions, and a substantial amount of money in civil penalties brought by the families of the 11 who had died. The ruling was published at the Thorngate Post House, and Gideon read it on a Tuesday morning, and then went to find Murack and gave her the document. She read it standing in the doorway of the dock shed, one hand on the newly raised doorframe, and when she looked up there was something in her face that was not quite satisfaction but was close, the expression of a person who went after something hard and difficult and brought it back. 11 people, she said. Yes, he said. It does not bring them back. No, she folded the document carefully. But the wrong is named, and the people who chose to let it happen are named. That is not nothing. She looked at him. It is what we could do, we did it. He took the document back from her and put it on the shelf where important things went, and she came into the shed, and he put his arms around her, and she put her forehead against his, which was a contact that she had told him was significant in Orc custom. The meeting of foreheads was a recognition of mutual standing, of two people acknowledging each other as real and present and equal. He had started doing it back when she did it, and she had looked at him the first time he mirrored it with an expression of surprised warmth that he kept in his memory like the river stone on the windowsill, a smooth and particular thing. The autumn came. The Ashwalker clan's autumn passage came through Thorngate in September, and Murack rejoined the clan for the crossing 60-some people on the ferry over 3 days, horses and supply packs, and the organized movement of a large group that had been doing this route for generations. Gideon ran the crossings from before dawn to after dark, and Murack worked alongside him on the 3rd day, helping with the loading logistics in the way that suggested she had done this before, because she had crossed this ferry as part of the clan passage 4 times in 3 years. On the evening of the 3rd day, when the last of the clan was across and Gideon was securing the barge, he looked up and found her standing on the dock watching him with the direct, quiet attention that he knew now was her version of tenderness. "How long before you come back?" he asked. "The winter route is 3 months, back through Thorngate in the late melt, end of February if the passes are kind." She looked at him. "I have spoken with the Passage Council about the independent travel status. It can be renewed indefinitely for senior members with demonstrated purpose. The documentation of the guild case constitutes purpose under clan charter." He looked at her. "Renewed indefinitely." "Indefinitely," she said, "with the expectation that I rejoin for both annual passages, which I will do in any case because the clan is mine and the passage is my responsibility. But the time between," she looked at the river, then back at him, "the clan understands what anchor companion means. It is not a secret thing. The Passage Council has seen this before in different configurations. They are not opposed." He was quiet for a moment. "The water ran under the dock. And you? What do you want?" She looked at him with the full directness. "I want this to be how my life is organized," she said. "Clan passage twice a year, here with you between. The river and the ferry and the dock shed and the evenings. That is what I want." She paused. "I want to come back to you, again and again, for as long as you want me to." "As long as I want you to," he repeated. "Murack, that is not a quantity that has a natural limit." She made the sound that was halfway between a growl and a laugh, and she crossed the dock and took his face in her hands and kissed him with the same directness she had brought to every significant thing she had ever done. and he kissed her back and held on, because this was the thing he had been not missing exactly, but not having, which is a different kind of absence. And now he had it, and it was her, specifically, entirely her. And that was right in the way that very few things in his life had been straightforwardly, undeniably right. She left with the clan the following morning. He stood at the road's edge, as he had in autumn the year before, and she turned in her saddle and looked at him, and this time she raised one hand, a small, deliberate gesture, a greeting going forward rather than a farewell going back, and he raised his in return. He went to the dock and ran the morning crossing. The winter had the same background hum it always had, but it was different now in its quality, not the hum of absence but the hum of interim, which is a different thing entirely. He was waiting, yes, but he was waiting for something specific that was coming back, and that changed the character of the time in a way that was substantial. He wrote to her more easily than he had before, because they had said the true things now, and the letters did not need to carry the weight of unspoken intentions. She wrote back in a combination of Orcish and common tongue, and he was learning the Orcish, slowly, picking it up the way a man picks up a river language when he spends enough time on a particular stretch of water. Redmast and Sons was formally dissolved by the Regional Guild Authority in December, the last of the legal threads from the autumn's resolution. The grain supply routes along the river towns were re-established under new oversight. Thorngate's population began recovering toward its pre-sickness numbers. The sickness did not come back. February came, and then March, and then the early melt in the passes, and then a morning when he was on the water at first light, and he heard the sound of a horse on the south road and looked up. She came down the road at an easy canter, travel pack behind the saddle, braid dusty from the road, and she pulled up at the dock and looked at him on the barge and smiled. The full, genuine smile that changed her face the way sunlight changes a landscape. He pulled the barge in and stepped off the dock onto the bank, and she swung down from the horse and he went to her, and she put her hands on his face, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there on the river bank in the thin spring light, and the river ran past them loud and cold with the melt, and the birds were starting up in the reeds, and everything was very ordinary and completely extraordinary. "The pass is cleared early," she said against his cheek. "I know," he said. "I have been watching the weather since January." She pulled back enough to look at him, and there was the warmth in her face that he kept in his memory alongside the river stone and the letter in Orcish, and the morning on the barge when they drifted into the reeds. "How is the ferry?" "The eastern tie post is still within the lease boundary," he said. "I checked twice, just to be certain." She laughed, and he laughed, and the sound of it went out over the spring river, and then he took her hand and walked her up the bank toward the dock, and the season turned toward warmth. The months that followed had the quality of a thing settling into its shape. Not in the sense of becoming dull. The aliveness of her company never became ordinary, and the days on the river had the same quality they had always had of containing more than they appeared to, but in the sense of a thing finding the form it was made for. She came back in February, stayed through the summer, left with the autumn passage, came back in the late melt of the following year. The independent travel status held. The clan came through Thorngate twice a year and crossed the ferry, and she worked the crossings alongside him. And the Ashwalker clan's passage had, over the course of 2 years, become something that the Thorngate trading post had quietly reorganized itself to accommodate faster service, better loading areas. A respect that was not yet universal, but was considerably more widespread than it had been the autumn before the trial. The dock shed had been modified again. The shelf for non-work items held several objects now, the river stone from before, a small copper trade weight that was hers, a piece of dried herb from the silver bark bundle she had brought back from the Brack Hills, a folded letter in Orcish, 2 chairs with backs on them well worn, a third hook by the door for a second coat. The stove flue drew better in winter. The doorframe was still adjusted for a taller person, and it was never going to be adjusted back. In the late summer of the second year, They rode north together along the river road to the Brack Hills. Because the guild's investigation had concluded that the herb trader there had been working through intermediaries for Redmast and Sons, and the formal documentation required a witness to the original confiscation. It was a 3-day ride, through country that opened up into rolling hills and thin forests and the smell of rock and elevation, and they camped on the second night under a clear sky at a site she knew from the clan's old route. She cooked, which surprised him. He had not known she cooked, because they always ate at the tavern or he made the stew in the shed, and she made something with dried meat and hillside herbs that was extraordinary, and he said so. And she told him that the clan traveled light but not badly, and that there was a tradition of good trail cooking because a meal at a fire was one of the things the clan organized itself around, and she had been doing it since she was old enough to be trusted with the fire. He washed the cooking pot in the stream because she had cooked, and she watched him do it with an expression of mild surprise. "You do not have to," she said. "You cooked," he said. "That is a reasonable distribution of labor." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are a very easy person to be with." He looked up from the stream. "You say that like it surprises you." "It does," she said honestly. "Most people I have to hold in a particular way, make sure certain things are managed, certain distances maintained. With you," she paused, "there is no management required. You are simply there, and that is good." He set the pot aside and dried his hands and went back to the fire and sat beside her, and she leaned against him with a comfortable ease that was its own kind of declaration. And they sat with the fire and the stars and the night sounds of the hills and said nothing further for a long time, which was sufficient. The Brack Hills trip was completed without incident. The documentation was filed. The former herb trader's operation was officially listed in the guild fraud record. The last thread of the Redmast scheme was closed. On the ride back south, with the high plains opening up below them and the line of the river visible in the distance and Thorngate somewhere in the shimmer of the heat, Murex said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "The clan bonding ceremony," she said. "It is not a human ceremony, and I am not asking you to adopt a custom that does not fit your life. But the spoken claim, which I made on the dock in June of last year, has a counterpart in formal practice, a witnessed restatement in front of the clan, which moves the anchor companion status into the clan record and makes it a recognized bond." She paused. "It would mean something to me, to have it witnessed. To have you in the clan record as my anchor companion." She glanced at him. "If you want that." He looked at the plains ahead. "Is it a ceremony?" he asked. "Specific rituals, specific requirements?" "There is a speaking and a witnessing and a marking. The marking is optional, a clan tattoo that some couples take and some do not. The speaking is the important part." She looked at him. "I would not ask you to do something that felt like a performance or an obligation. I am asking if you want to." "I want to," he said without hesitation. She looked at him for a moment with the copper-coin eyes. "You did not think about it." "I did not need to," he said. "I want to be in the clan record as your anchor companion. I want to stand up in front of the clan and say it." He looked at her steadily. "And I would take the marking if you want to. I would like to carry something of yours." She reached across from her horse and took his hand, briefly but firmly. And then the road leveled out and they pushed the horses to a canter, and the plains opened wide around them and the river was ahead, and everything was coming together in the way of a life that has finally found its true shape. The witnessed restatement happened at the autumn passage, in the salt circle that had been cleared and re-salted for the occasion. The same circle where, a year and a half ago, she had stood up from the stone bench and said his name in a way that cut through everything else in the room. This time she stood beside him, not across the circle from him. The passage council sat on the stone benches. The clan was gathered around the outside of the circle, warriors and traders and elders and scouts, 60-some people in the thin September light. A few Thorngate residents had come to the edge of the camp to watch from a distance, which Gideon suspected would not have happened a year ago. But something had shifted in Thorngate, incrementally, in the time since the trial and the guild resolution, and some of the townspeople had a different relationship to the Waycamp now. The council elder was a woman named Brash Callan, tall and white-braided and wearing clan-marked jewelry that caught the light, and she led the speaking in Orcish first and then in the common tongue for Gideon's benefit, though by this point his Orcish was good enough that he followed the Orcish version mostly, and only fell behind on the formal legal phrasing. Murak spoke her restatement. Her voice was steady and low and certain. She said his name again in the guttural roll that made it sound like a word with weight and iron, and it went into the air of the salt circle the same way it had 18 months ago, but this time it was not a summons or a challenge. It was a declaration. It was a vow. He said his own words in the common tongue, slowly and clearly, and he was aware of the watching clan and the watching townspeople, and the passage council's attentive faces, and none of it made him want to be elsewhere or made him feel the smallness he had sometimes felt in public situations. He felt clear. He felt entirely present. When it was done, the council elder declared the bond witnessed and recorded, and the clan made the sound they made for acknowledgement, a low collective sound, voices together, that resonated in the chest in a way that nothing purely human quite did. The marking was done afterward in private by the clan's marker keeper, a man of 40 with a steady hand and a small iron set of tools. They took the mark on the inside of the left wrist, a simple design, 2 lines intertwined, which was the clan symbol for anchor companion. Gideon had seen the same mark on the wrists of several clan members, and now he had it too, dark against the skin of his wrist, and he held his arm alongside Murak's in the lamplight of the marking tent and looked at the 2 matching marks and felt something deep and quiet and permanent settle in him. She turned his wrist over in her hands and looked at the mark and then at him, and the expression on her face was the most completely open he had ever seen it, not guarded or strategic or controlled, just fully present and fully feeling, all the coppercoin warmth of her unmediated. "Thank you," she said, very quietly. "For all of it." "Thank you," he said back, "for saying my name." She looked at him, a small questioning lift of her eyebrow. "In the trial," he said, "a year and a half ago you said my name and it came out sounding like a vow. I did not understand then what it meant, but I know now." He looked at her steadily. "You were saying I intend you, even before you knew you were saying it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in Orcish, a phrase that he knew by now, the phrase that translated to root knowing, seeing someone when it matters. "Yes," he said, "that." She leaned forward and put her forehead against his, and he pressed back. The contact of equal standing, 2 people acknowledging each other as real and present and permanent, and the lamplight held steady and the clan camp was warm with fires outside, and the river was a half a mile south running on its course as it had before either of them existed, and as it would after. The autumn was good. The seasons after the witnessed restatement had a different quality than the seasons before, not better exactly, because those seasons had been very good, but more settled, more fully inhabited. She came back from the winter route at the end of February, slightly earlier than the previous year, because the passes were generous. She brought additional medicinal herbs from the southern contacts and spent 2 weeks working with the Thorngate healer on a standing supply arrangement that gave the town reliable access to the remedies that had been so scarce during the sickness. The arrangement was documented with the guild and filed with the charter keeper, and it was, Gideon thought, exactly the kind of thing that changed towns incrementally. Not a dramatic gesture, not a confrontation, but a practical good that made people's lives more reliable, and that had a name attached to it, Murak Ashwalker and the Ashwalker clan, and over enough seasons that name and those practical goods would do more than any argument. He said something to this effect one evening and she listened and then said, "That is a very long game." "You are a patient person," he said. "I am not always a patient person," she said. "I am strategic. There is a difference." "Is there?" She thought about it, Patience is waiting. Strategy is working while you wait. She looked at him. I have been doing both here. He looked at her across the table in the dock shed. The stove was going and the river was outside and the two chairs were well worn and everything was familiar. Working toward what? He asked. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke it was with the considered quality of someone choosing words for their precision. A place in this town where the clan can come through without calculating the cost of every look on every face, she said. A town that has a history with us that is not only suspicion. She paused. It is possible. I have seen towns like that further south. Towns that had the same history as Thorngate and then something happened. Sometimes a crisis managed together. Sometimes simply time and the accumulation of ordinary transactions and the calculation changed. The town changed. She looked at him. This could be that town. He thought about it. The sickness and the trial and the guild resolution, which had shown Thorngate clearly that the threat had come from within rather than without. The 2 years of passage crossings with Murak working alongside him on the barge. The supply arrangement with the healer. The incremental, unglamorous accumulation of ordinary good interactions. I think it already is, he said. Starting to be, she nodded slowly. Starting to be, she agreed. That is enough. They did not solve Thorngate. They did not change every mind or remove every difficulty. The world was what it was, a hard and particular place where humans and orcs had a long history that did not dissolve in a season or two, and where fear and prejudice were persistent features of the landscape. But the specific corner of that world that was Thorngate Trading Post and the Ashwalker clan's biannual passage and the ferry dock on the Thorngate Bend had shifted, measurably, from what it had been. And that was a thing they had done together, partly by intention and partly by simply being present and doing the ordinary work of living honestly in a place. In the late summer of the second year after the bonding, a full year past the witnessed restatement, Gideon was doing the early crossing when he found himself thinking about the morning 18 months before the trial when she had first crossed on his ferry and argued about the toll. He could see it very clearly, the way she had stood on the ferry with her arms crossed and her chin up, and her copper-coin eyes fixed on him with the particular focused quality of a woman who intended to be right about the ferry toll, and was not going to be moved on the matter. He had found her interesting then. He had found her interesting the second crossing and the third. By the fourth crossing, which was the summer before the trial, he had been looking for her on the autumn passage list without acknowledging to himself that he was looking for her. He was a man who had come late to the knowledge of his own feelings, he thought. Or not late, he had had the feelings. He had simply not had a framework for trusting them, for understanding that the particular wanting of a specific person was not a thing to be managed or set aside, but a thing to be moved toward. She had given him that framework by the simple and remarkable act of moving toward him herself, directly and without apology. He pulled the barge in on the east bank and let the morning travelers off and stood at the prow while they organized themselves. And the light was very early and very clear, and the river was summer-low and slow, and everything was good. She was waiting for him on the dock when he came back across. She did this sometimes, came down to meet the early crossing rather than waiting at the shed or the tavern. She was standing on the dock with a cup in each hand, which meant she had gone to the tavern kitchen and gotten the morning tea, which was a Thorngate custom she had adopted with a pragmatic unself-consciousness that Sorrel at the tavern appreciated enormously. He tied off and stepped up onto the dock, and she handed him the cup and they stood there with the early light on the water, and he looked at her, and she looked back, and both of them were just straightforwardly, quietly happy, which is the best and rarest state available to people, and is not a small thing at all. Brash Callan sent a message with the advance courier, she said. The autumn passage is on schedule, 22nd of September. Good, he said. I will have the east loading area cleared and the barge in full order. She also said, Murak paused, and there was the fractional quality of someone organizing something they want to say correctly, that the clan is considering establishing a permanent cold season camp at the South Way camp. Not the full clan, a rotation of 6 to 8 members, traders and a healer through the winter months. As a trading presence in the post, she looked at him. It has been discussed before in other locations. The clan has 2 permanent presence camps in the southern towns. It is not unprecedented. She paused. Thorngate has been proposed as the third. He looked at her. Is that because of the supply arrangement, the sickness work? Those things contributed, she said, and the charter standing from the trial. And she looked at the river, the demonstrated stability of the clan's relationship with this crossing and this post over the past 3 years. She glanced at him sideways. My presence here has also been noted as a relevant factor in the assessment of stability. You, he said, and your anchor companion who runs the ferry. The Passage Council did not explicitly mention the ferryman, she said, with a dry inflection. But I believe he was implied. He looked at the river for a moment and felt the full weight of the shape his life had taken, the ferry and the river and the dock shed and the early mornings and the evenings and the woman beside him. And now the possibility of the clan in winter, a presence in Thorngate that would be permanent and ordinary rather than seasonal and cautious. The town was starting to be that town. It was working. He looked at her. Tell Brash Callan yes, he said. Tell her Thorngate is ready. Murak looked at him, and the warmth in her face was complete. She put her free hand on his chest, flat and warm as it always was, and he put his over hers, and the morning went on around them, the river and the birds in the reeds and the first of the day's traders beginning to appear on the road above the bank, and somewhere in the town, the post-house bell counting the hour. Her hand was warm through his shirt. The mark on the inside of his left wrist was a year old and would be there always. The river ran south past the dock and around the bend where the water was too deep to ford, and the nearest bridge was 30 miles downstream. And he had been crossing it every day for 3 years, and planned to go on crossing it for a good long while, which was a thing that had once felt like simply a fact about his life and now felt like a particular and deliberate choice. Because it was the place he had found her, or she had found him, or they had found each other. Arguing about a toll in the cold early light of an autumn morning, he raised his cup, she raised hers. They drank the morning tea on the dock in the summer light, and the Thorngate trading post came awake around them, and the water ran, and they stayed.